Okay. Good evening again, everybody. It's Parashat Vayeshev. Happens to be my bar mitzvah parsha, so a special fond place in my heart for this parsha of amazing narrative. Um, I attended this morning the funeral of Menorah Rotenberg. Was an amazing um, early advocate for women's participation in learning and in tefillah and ritual. She was a psychoanalyst and found deep meaning in the family dynamics dimensions of the stories in Breshit, and apparently was many years into work on a book on the Yosef stories, but was very, very precise in her analysis and never was able to quite kind of finish and let the work go. I don't know if it will ultimately be posthumously published, but I think if you look up her name and Yosef, you may find some small bits of it have been published in various publications already. Um, and they are extraordinary stories, and we're going to look at Rabbi Zach's comments on a couple of them, including one which is more evokes the genre of parallel stories analysis, as James pointed out, that we've been seeing less of in recent weeks, but we'll have at least one of those tonight. So let me share my screen. Okay, start with this one, which I thought was something I never thought about before, and look forward to looking at with you. Whom do the sun and moon represent? Yosef recounts his second dream to his brothers and then to his father. In the dream, Hashemesh v'hayarech v'achadasar kochavim mishtachavim li. The sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Yaakov berates him. Ma chalom hazeh asher chalamta. What, he said to him, is this dream you have dreamed? Havo navo ani v'imecha v'achecha lishtachavot lecha arza. You can see I have this parsha a little more at my fingertips in the Hebrew. Are we to come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow low to you to the ground? How are we to understand the reaction? Rashi cites the Midrash that Yaakov was angry at the dream because Rachel, Yosef's mother, had already died. But the moon represented Bilhah, Rachel's servant, who acted as a mother to Yosef after Rachel's death. Rashi offers a second option, that the moon in the dream does not represent anyone. Every dream has some false elements. Okay, so the question we're dealing with is, who does the sun represent? Yaakov makes it clear that he understands it to be Yosef's mother, but Yosef's mother, as Rachel, has already died. So maybe it's Bilhah, or maybe it doesn't. It's just a kind of extraneous element in the dream. However, the straightforward understanding of Yaakov's response is that he was angry at the idea of parents and older siblings bowing to Yosef. This would be true even if Rachel were alive. Just the whole notion of the dream of all these people who were older than Yosef coming to bow down to him, Yaakov didn't like it. But then we are left with the question of who is represented by the moon. At the end of the story, only Yaakov, at the very end, when he comes, and the brothers earlier on when they come down to Egypt, bow to Yosef. Further, Yaakov's bowing does not seem like a bow of submission, but rather as a form of thanks for Yosef's agreeing to bury his father in Marat HaMachpelah. I believe this is referring to the beginning of Parashat Vayechi, Vayishtachu Yisrael al Rosh Hamitah. I didn't check if that's the pasuk he's referring to. And in fact, Yosef bows to Yaakov in return. So it's clearly not a bow of submission like the dream interpretation makes it seem like it would be. Though the dream does not seem to be fulfilled in its entirety, the brothers certainly took it seriously. So his brothers were wrought up at him, and his father kept the matter in mind. By kanuvo echav vaviv shamar et hadavar. At the time of the dream, they already were bothered by it. What did Yaakov think was going to happen? Why was he upset at the outset? Perhaps the sun and moon represent something completely different, something completely unbelievable. Another place in the Torah mentions the sun, the moon, and the stars all together. And when you look up to the sky and behold the sun and the moon and the stars, the whole heavenly host, you must not be lured into bowing down to them or serving them. These the Lord your God allotted to other peoples everywhere under heaven. Right? Dvarim Dalid. Here we're talking about the notion of you know, not worshiping idols, and Moshe's kind of central theme, one of the absolute central themes of his speeches in Dvarim, not worshiping idols when you go into the land, and the idea that, or worshiping, I don't call them idols, but worshiping other beings or bodies, and understanding that, these things are worshipped by other peoples. They're not the supreme God, and they're not for us to worship. That is, the heavenly bodies represent the gods of other nations, and by extension, all the nations of the world. The dream, okay, this is Rav Bazak's big reveal, right? So if the sun, moon, and stars show up in one other place, we'll see maybe a second, but one other place in the Chumash, and that's in a warning about worshiping them because they are the gods of other nations, then the dream would then symbolize all of humanity submitting to Yosef. In other words, sort of everyone who would worship these things as represented by these as the gods, so to speak, of all of humanity, bowing to Yosef. The dream would then symbolize all of humanity submitting to Yosef. This does have some significance, given that there was a ritual of sun worship in Egypt, meaning it's not a preposterous idea. According to the Tel Amarna inscriptions, the Egyptians worshipped Pharaoh as a sun god. The dream comes true in the fact that Yosef does rule over Egypt, and thus over the known world of his time. The sun, moon, and stars are also mentioned at the creation of the world. God made the two great lights, the greater light to dominate the day, and the lesser light to dominate the night, and the stars. Now here we don't have it named in the way that it's named in Dvarim, Shemesh, Yareach, and Kochavim. It's called the Me'or HaGadol and the Me'or HaKatan and the Kochavim. So same three bodies, slightly different names. The sun and moon symbolize not only rulership of the nations and their gods, but sovereignty over night and day. That would be a dream of unfathomable dominance. Okay, so this is Rabbi Zak's take again. I've never heard this take before, that Yosef's dream, and driven by his kind of picking apart the logic, even though this is how Yaakov interprets the dream, right? And we're obviously biased very much by the fact that Yaakov hears the dream and says, what, am I and your brothers and your mother going to come bow down to you? We sort of take Yaakov's interpretation at face value. That must be what the dream means. After all, let's also, Rav Bazak doesn't mention this, but let's also remember that the previous dream was all explicitly Yosef says, we were all binding sheaves in the field and all your sheaves bowed down to my sheaf. So the previous dream Yosef explicitly expresses has to do with things that he identifies with his own brothers bowing down to him. So it's natural, on the one hand, that Yaakov then interprets the next dream as, the family bowing down to him. But this kind of weak part of the question of who does the sun represent, and the idea that ultimately the entire family bowing down to him doesn't exactly come to pass, and one bowing is not a submissive bowing. So Rabbi Zak pokes enough holes in this theory to kind of open us up to think about something different. Then he uses another appearance of Shemesh, Yareach, and Kochavim to point towards those things as the things that all people of the world, all other people of the world worship, and therefore sort of symbolic of the authority of all people. And those bowing down to Yosef would be symbolic of kind of the whole world coming to bow down to him. And he sort of suggests in a way that actually does happen, enhancing the plausibility of that being what the dream meant, and also helping us understand why Yaakov would find it even more outrageous, not just the family, but kind of the whole world, and being, maybe particularly uneasy or worried about that interpretation. And I think also, the same thing could be interpreted and could point in either direction, following on the dream of the sheaves. On the one hand, you could say, okay, it should be of the same general idea. The sheaves are the family bowing down, and this is just like a different version of the family bowing down, a la, Paro's dreams, which were two different dreams, but they were on the same general theme of the years of plenty and then the years of famine that are going to swallow that up. Or you could take a different approach and say that these are kind of, um, you know, progressive dreams. The first dream is the family or the brothers, and the second dream is kind of symbolic of the whole world coming to bow down. And so it's these, increasing visions of grandeur for Yosef, and it sort of goes too far. Right? The notion of all brothers bowing down to a younger brother wouldn't be foreign to Yaakov, even though again it might make him uneasy. But the idea of the whole world bowing down could make a parent feel like my kid has lost it, and this isn't a good direction to be going in. So I find it, as we often comment, I don't know if I'm 100% convinced by the answer, but the challenges to the prevailing interpretation are very good, and there's a lot, I think, to the merit of this interpretation. And happy to hear any comments or reactions to this comment of Rav Bazak. Yeah, Marjorie, and then Lance.
I just have a question to ask you. I
Please.
don't understand Yaakov's anger because isn't a dream nevuah?
That's an
Like,
interesting
like
question.
I understand, like interpreting a dream, I could understand why he might think Yosef is full of himself. Like, especially with the sheaves, I'd be like,
Right,
honey, there are, let's not. And
right,
also like the literalness, like my understanding was dreams aren't necessarily literal. You don't have to
right,
have every piece make sense.
right, right.
I just don't understand the anger. Yaakov got dreams, received dreams from Hashem. He knows they
Mm-hmm.
aren't a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't get that part. I love the idea of like the literary looking and the comparison, the literary comparison Rav Bazak did, and I would love to look at
Mm-hmm.
the actual words, like not the translation, but I
Yeah,
really, really fascinating. But the
yeah,
piece I just don't get.
yeah, yeah. Okay, great question. Like, just take a moment to look at the psukim in their context. Um, right? So he has the first dream binding sheaves, and all the other sheaves bow down, and his brothers say, are you going to rule over us? And they hated him even more. He dreams another dream and tells us to his brothers, Hine chalamti chalam od, v'nei hashemesh v'yarech v'chadasar kochabim, sun, moon, and 11 stars are bowing down to me. And he told it to his father and his brothers. It's also just interesting, the repetition. First says, Vaysaperoto le'achav, he told it to his brothers. Then it says, Vaysaper el aviv ve'el he told it to his father and his brothers. I don't know what that seems to indicate, a possible repetition. And his father, it's interesting. The anger, I think I use that term, but that's not exactly what the text says. Vayigar bo aviv. Berated is one translation. Rebuke. It's a kind of like it's a pushback kind of term. Put somebody in their place. So, I could imagine taking your approach, and I think the sages absolutely, and I think biblically, we generally do understand dreams as prophetic or kind of, effectively foretelling, um, not things to be dismissed. But I could almost imagine, you know, I don't know if called pedagogically or just, yeah, something like that. Apparently, Yaakov, right? Because sorry, I'm trying to say too many things at once. Remember that it ends with Aviv Shamara Tadavar. His father kept the matter in mind. So we have two reactions from Yaakov. One is the one that's direct to Yosef, and that might just be like hey, don't get too full of yourself. Don't let it get to your head, right? Not in a way of saying, even though he does question it, is this really going to happen? Maybe that's just his way of saying, okay, easy does it, one thing at a time, because he does the Shamara Tadavar does make it feel like he took the matter to heart. He was like, yeah, okay, this is a dream. This could happen, but I don't want my son to therefore start trying to put himself in that place. So maybe it's reflective of that kind of, it's not a denial of the potential prophetic nature of the dream, but it's sort of like, okay, fine, you dreamed it. Let's not change our lives over it, kind of thing. But yeah, it's a great question, great comment. Kind of how are we viewing dreams and how do we view the reaction in light of it? Lance and then Bracha.
Okay, what if the sun, the moon, and the stars were the sun, the moon, and the stars? What if this is about the astral religion, which is a religion in which heavenly bodies control human beings? What if by the heavenly bodies bowing down to Joseph, the heavenly bodies were bowing down, in effect, to the monotheistic Hebrew God? So that sort of changes the whole thing in a way, because it shows that Joseph is really an avatar of God.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout Joseph's life, God has been with him, God has enabled him, and he's in an upward arc. And the Ish, which I would see as an angel, a turning point in a narrative, so to speak. This turning point here with the sun, the moon, and the stars is a turning point in really the history of the early Middle East, in which the believers that the gods, sort of worshiper of the gods, are suddenly undermined and subverted without getting rid of the astral religion. In other words, it's okay for the sun, the moon, and the stars to have an effect, but that effect is God's effect. And the whole thing is about God.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating reading. It's certainly, the notion of identifying Joseph with God, as you pointed out, is very prominent. People see that God is with him. It still feels like a one step to get from there and say that he represents God, and therefore the bowing down to him represents kind of the other things that are worshipped, acknowledging their submission to the supreme God or the Israelite God or the Hebrew God. But I let's add it to the hopper of possible interpretations. I think it's very interesting. Thank you. Racha.
Yeah, I find the language very interesting in terms of the Joseph story. When it says that he tells his father it's Vayeshev, and when it speaks of them the brothers continuing to hate him, it's Vayosifu. It's like so Yosef centered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Saying the sound, both Vayosifu is Yosef and Vayesaper has in it, the Yud Samech Pei of
Both
Yosef.
from him and from the brothers. There's
Mm-hmm.
one
Mm-hmm.
central character there
Yeah, that's really
that we can't
interesting.
get away from.
Yeah, yeah. It's great noticing of those kind of overlapping sounds. Yeah. Good. So again, I love this Rebbe Bazak just for kind of opening up another lens or direction of how to think about that dream. And obviously in this half of Breshit, dreams are so significant and prominent, and kind of which way we interpret it, impact both is impacted by and then impacts the way we see some of the other dreams. So a lot to take there. Okay. We're going to jump forward a little bit further. And then time permitting, maybe we'll see one more, but I didn't want to miss this one towards the end.
Joseph actually interpret any of the dreams?
Not right. It doesn't seem like he. Oh, it's a good question. Did Yosef interpret the dreams? Right. So clearly, in the second one, he doesn't seem to be. He's just describing, just narrates it as it happens. And even in the first one, he just seems to narrate it as it happens. Yeah.
I had the same question as Roger reading it over this morning. Like, what did he do wrong? He just said, I had a dream, and this is what the dream, the images I saw.
Right.
The brothers and the father are the interpreters of the dream and interpreting a negative gloss on it.
Yeah. 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 I mean, what's the non-negative gloss? Meaning it, again, I don't want to use the term negative. someone comes and says, I dreamt a bunch of stuff bowing in each of them, right? In each of them, it includes mishtachavim li, right? Bowing down to me. The 11 sheaves, or sorry, bowing down to my sheaf in the first one and bowing down to me in the second one. So, without, yeah, I guess here's what I guess I'll take from your comment. Clearly, the reactions say something about the context. They say something about the sensitivity or negative predisposition that Yosef's brothers have towards him. And we have that already, right? They have the way the beginning of the Parsha kind of narrates it is Yosef brings bad reports about the brothers to their father.
Not all the brothers, just the brothers of the handmaids, right?
Yeah, that is the likely reading of that section. Yeah, yeah. Bnei Bilhah and Bnei Zilpah brings bad reports of them. Then we're told that Yaakov, loves Yosef the most. Then seeing that the brothers hate him, then he has the dreams. So yeah, no one is blameless here, to be fair. There's a lot of conflict and a lot of ungenerous actors and a lot of ungenerous interpretation. And so, it's sort of primed for that. But to the question of what does Yosef do wrong, maybe in this moment, nothing, but he's done enough to set things off that then when you come around, like maybe all he did wrong was just, why did he tell them about the dreams? Keep it to yourself. It's just going to stir up enmity or jealousy as their reaction was. So I think you're right. I mean, I absolutely agree with the point that he didn't come along and say to them, look what I dreamed and look what that meant and look who I therefore am. But in an inflamed environment, he certainly added fuel to the fire, I guess is what I would say. Yeah. Back to Marjorie.
Wasn't he a teenager?
Yeah, he was. Are we told explicitly he was 17? Yeah.
He's 17.
Yeah.
He grew up in a house where Avraham Avinu was his grandfather, right?
Abraham was his
Great-grandfather.
great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather. His grandfather was Yitzchak, who was sacrificed.
Yes.
And then Yaakov's his father, who stole the Bechorah.
Yeah.
Right. So he's growing up in an environment of godliness, nevuah, things like we don't get. It must have been terrifying to be 17 years old.
Mm.
And as much as you're full of yourself, to get a dream like that, and I don't know, like is a nevuah dream different? Like, does it feel different than a regular dream someone has?
Right.
But to get that kind of dream, of course he went to his father and his brothers. I'm scared. Like, I had this bizarre dream, and the parents, and they had a moment of connection instead of disconnection. Like, again, Yaakov dropped the ball and again, the parenting ball was dropped with but like,
right. Yeah, another interesting.
I like your reading that he said, like, don't get too big for your britches, but like, this is nevuah, but it could have been a discussion. And like, it's the same way the nevuah he had no control over. The choices God was making for Yosef, he had no control over.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Great. Okay, good. That was our biggest conversation of any Rav Bazak essay yet. Got a good reactions. Okay, let's see another one. Here we go. Yosef's tests and Akedat Yitzchak. Chazal famously refer to Yosef as Hatzadik, the righteous one, particularly because he withstood the advances of Potiphar's wife. They understood his challenge broadly. And here we have a lengthy quote from the Gemara in Yoma. This is all Agadah in the Talmud. They said about Yosef the righteous. Again, I'm trying to think. I don't recall Yosef being called Sadiq in the Chumash. Could be later, but I don't think I don't remember him being called tzaddik. This is very much a title that Chazal give him. They said about Yosef the righteous, each and every day the wife of Potiphar seduced him with words. In addition, the clothes that she wore to entice him in the morning, she did not wear to entice him in the evening. The clothes that she wore to entice him in the evening, she did not wear to entice him in the morning of the next day. So got lots of wardrobe change in order to seduce him. One day she said to him, "Submit to me and have relations with me." He said to her, "No." She said to him, "I will incarcerate you in the prison." He said to her, "I do not fear you. As it is stated, God releases prisoners. Adonai matir asurim." We say this in this, where we're going to get a couple successive quotes from. We say it in Psukei de Zimra every morning, and the first of the Hallelujahs after Ashrei. He said to her, "I don't fear you, because it states God releases prisoners." She said to him, "I will cause you to be bent over with suffering." He says, "Adonai zokef kefufim." God straightens those who are bent over. She said, "I will blind your eyes." He said to her, "Adonai pokeach ivrim." God opens the eyes of the blind. She gave him 1,000 talents of silver to submit to her. Lishkav etzla lihiyot ima, to lie beside her, to be with her, and he refused. Okay, so when Rabbi Bazak says here, they understood his challenge broadly. This was not just in the sense that the story only zeroes in kind of on one moment, but the Midrash expands it out to much more extensive seduction, temptation, threat, etc. The Torah appreciates Yosef's greatness and alludes to the greatest sacrifice, Akedat Yitzchak, by opening and closing both the account of the Akedah and the incident with Potiphar's wife with the same words, Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, and it was after these things. Okay, that's the opening and the closing of the Akedah, chapter 22, and the opening and closing of the story of the incident with Potiphar's wife. This expression is only used in these two places in the Torah. That's interesting. God tells Abraham at the Akedah. Now we're going on to more, parallels. God tells Abraham at the Akedah, "Al tishlach yadcha al hanar, v'al tas lo me'uma." Right? Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know ki yirei Elohim ata, that you fear God, v'lo chasachta et bincha yechidcha mimeni, and you did not withhold your son, your favored one, from me. Et bincha sharahavta, maybe, I don't remember exactly the quote there. These words are echoed when Yosef tells Potiphar's wife that her husband has withheld nothing from me, v'lo chasach mimeni me'uma, except yourself, kim otach b'asher atishto. How then could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God? So this language of me'uma, of lo chasach, not withholding, appears in both. This accentuates another point of comparison. Just as the Akedah proved that Abraham feared God, this incident shows that Yosef too fears God. He will say of himself later, Eta Elohim ani yareh, I am a God-fearing man. Chazal say, it says, revere only the Lord your God. Be like those of whom it is said that they feared God, Avraham, Eov, and Yosef. Meaning there's a comment of Chazal on the command to revere the Lord your God, that it says, follow in the footsteps of those about whom the Torah says that they are God-revering, Yirei Elohim. And we have Eov and Avraham and Yosef. So from our characters of the Chumash, it's Avraham and Yosef. This, by the way, is an interesting, just the placement of Eov here in between Avraham and Yosef relates to a many points of view debate about when Eov lived. This opinion of Chazal makes it seem like he lived, in the early biblical period. There are a wide range of opinions about when Eov lived. So you have to surmise that this opinion places him somewhere in between Abraham and Yosef. Otherwise, I don't know why he'd necessarily, unless we're going alphabetical order, why he would be placed in the middle in that list. Okay, so we have these figures as God-fearing in particular, almost exclusively and uniquely so in the Torah. The phrase Abraham looked up, Vayisa et einav, is echoed in the story of Yosef when it says his master's wife cast her eyes, Vatisa eshet Adonav et eineha, al Yosef. His master's wife cast her eyes. Again, it's not a radically uncommon language, but it's, not very, very common. And especially in that phrase, the casting her eyes a little bit could have been written out, a number of different ways. And it feels like a somewhat pointed connection to, of the other instances of lifting or directing one's eyes. In both cases, the person who was tested was alone with his test, right? Avram says to those, the lads who came with them, you stay here with the donkey, the boy and I will go up there, we will worship and we will return to you. And in the case of Yosef and Potiphar's wife, none of the household was there inside. Again, that's more of a necessary, narrative element in the Yosef story, but still, the text emphasizes it in both accounts. Okay, so those are our kind of literary and thematic parallels. The framing, the unique appearances of the framing language of this sort of language of fearing God, the particular language of withholding, of me'uma, the lifting up of eyes, and the alone context for each of the occasions. Obviously, so that's the bulk of this Rav Bazak is to point out the comparison. There's a lot we could make of it. His extraction of a message is brief, and he concludes with it. Obviously, the tests are very different. Avram was given a command by God, and he proved himself through his absolute loyalty to God. Yosef was being commanded by a person of authority, and his test was to refuse her command. What both have in common is that Abraham and Yosef, standing alone, overcame their natural human inclinations and stayed true to God's word. Right, I guess Avram's natural human inclination being the compassion, love for his child, which he overcame in some sense to follow God's command, and Yosef his natural, sexual temptation and inclination to follow God's word. I think there's obviously more factors at play than just what Rav Bazak writes here, but I think it's a pointed and interesting comparison, and again, some of the points of literary connection I might have caught, but I think putting it all together in one place and allowing us to think about, what we might take away from this comparison is great. Thoughts or reactions to setting alongside the binding of Isaac and Yosef's refusal to give in to the seduction of Potiphar's wife? Yeah, starting with Lance, go ahead.
Number one, I have to invoke the perhaps complex, which I just invented.
Yes.
And that what we're doing here, and I'm just as guilty when I talk about the astral religion, is to project our thoughts, our ideas, 20th century, 21st century ideas back onto a text, which for the original audience is extremely difficult to understand. And again, if you begin to look at this from the point of view of how, and I thought, Marjorie, I thought your analysis was absolutely fascinating and excellent. The problem is, are these human beings? In other words, the major question in Renaissance drama was, are they men or marionettes? And if you see these characters as puppets and you invoke the superiority of the plot, you have to ask yourself the question, if all this didn't happen with Potiphar's wife, would Joseph be in a position to interpret Pharaoh's dream or dreams? In other words, these things happen because of the plot, not because of some psychological, let's put this, that's my perhaps complex. Put it that way. This is my perhaps, and you look at Shakespeare, for example, there are thousands, maybe millions of commentaries on Shakespeare. Most of the people are projecting their own ideas, thoughts onto the text, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a confession of who we are.
Yes, I don't disagree, although I guess what I want to point out is what I appreciate is that he emphasizes the literary connections and offers just a few sentences of what, of the perhaps the perhaps about what the comparison is about. Now, you could also say that there's something in our modern eyes that assumes even that literary, parallels has to mean anything. But I think it certainly feels convincing to me, the things that he points out that draw our eye to these two stories to the exclusion of other ones. But what we take away from the comparison between them, I agree, is totally, conjecture and contextual to our own experiences. But it feels like a fair attempt to get in the mind of the Torah of why the Torah might have dropped some little literary hints, into these two stories.
May I just insert one
Yeah,
little thought? And that
please.
is, in Rabbani Bracha's class, we're dealing with the Megillah. And in the Megillah, there's this fascinating situation where Ahasuerus finds Haman sitting in Queen Esther's couch or something like that, and he goes nuts because he thinks that Haman has been screwing his wife, and
Yes.
it's exactly the same situation here, but with different twists and turns. Um, and again, in the Megillah, it doesn't completely in other words, what it does is it takes the focus away from the anti-Semitism and puts it into a different context. And here again, the focus is on uh, honor. Um, Joseph does the right thing. He rejects. I mean, think about James Bond. He he wouldn't hesitate for 1 second to have sex with somebody's wife. Wouldn't hesitate 1 second. But and he's the hero. He's a 20th century hero. But what fascinates me is how you can play with these texts in many, many different ways, and in a certain sense, Rav Stephen, are all valid.
Yeah. Great. Great. I like the James Bond comparison. Thank you. Marjorie and then Bracha.
It's interesting. How are we approaching this text? Are we approaching it as a literary text? Or are we approaching it as a history text? Because in history, at no point are the choices predetermined. Like you said that this had to happen. He had to not succumb to Potiphar so that he would be able to give nevuah or explain the dreams of the people in the prison. But history, even though it seems, because we're looking back at it, that it had to happen that way, but it didn't. Now, if this is someone writing a story, then yeah, I agree. You can put whatever you want where you want it. But like, how do we approach these texts? And do we believe that these texts happened? And at any point, even though if God knows the outcome, in theory, we have bechira because we don't know what the outcome is. So there are a lot of hashkafic and philosophical ways how are we looking at the words in the text and what is our purpose to go through it?
Yeah.
Just my
Great.
two.
Yes. The question is more important than any answer. So I think just we each will offer our own answer to the question. So great. Thank you. Bracha.
I didn't actually raise my hand to comment,
Oh,
but I'm very fascinated by Marjorie's comments, so let's leave it at that.
great. Sorry for misnoticing. Okay, good. I think we'll leave it here. I thought, some weeks I'm looking through for the top 2 or 3 to learn, and it's easier to find. Some weeks it's harder to find. A few of the ones here I think are, just highlight some familiar ideas that we've already seen, or maybe more familiar with. But to a comment, I thought all 7 of them were strong. So if you have it in the email, I encourage you to take a look through. But I think I picked my 2 favorites, and pleasure to get to learn them together. I believe we are unimpeded by secular breaks or even Hanukkah, and should be kind of continuing on Monday nights through the last few weeks of Breshit, and then we'll move to Shemot with a new commentator and keep everybody posted there. So great to learn together. Wishing everybody a great night. Love to mom and dad.
you.
Night to all.
Erev Tov.
Erev Tov. Bye.